Hello and welcome. I don't know about you, but these days when I look around at some of the so-called leaders who can hold such sway over our lives, I can dip into a bit of despair because there's so many of them that I don't even think could be described as leaders, and an awful lot of them who don't appear to understand what moral leadership is remotely about at all. To that end, I thought we'd take a bit of a dive into moral leadership. I've talked about it a little bit before, but in this video, what I thought might be useful is to quote from some people who talk about moral leadership and also to figure out what maybe we could do about it. What is it that we need to demand? So, to begin, let's look at this article here, The Coming Awakening of Moral Leadership. And from that article, it says, what is moral leadership? Moral leadership simply responds to what is right over wrong. True moral leadership responds when it is called upon, rises up when in need, and becomes an ally to the stranger and a defender to the defenseless. Moral leadership steps in when danger is inevitable and puts the good of the whole above the selfish interests of the few. Moral leadership is attainable. We need only try. Inspirational. However, is it a little bit naive? It can sound, to me at least, like the beginning of a Marvel movie. I can almost hear the music coming in and the voiceover artists who would read that out. Yeah, it's aspirational, but is that really something that is concrete enough for us to figure out what it is we need to do? I think based on that, no. However, later on in this article, I think there is something that it is quite concrete, and we'll come back to that. Before we get there, let's look here to this paper, The Emergence of Moral Leadership. I'm only going to pick out a couple of things from this paper, which is really interesting if you want to read it. It's quite a long read, and at least I've really got to focus on what the meaning is. The sentences are quite dense, there's a lot in them, but that's a good thing. That's a good exercise to go through rather than listening to some nonsense that an AI avatar spouts that we're all meant to take as being true. But that's a different subject for a different time, perhaps. So from that article, moral systems and organizations. In order to conceptualize such moral systems, we draw on Haidt. Now, Haidt is Jonathan, who has written a couple of books, one, in fact more than two, one, The Coddling of the American Mind, and also The Anxious Generation. Both really good books. Jonathan is a professor in this area, a social psychologist. So he defines moral systems. Now, note here, I'm talking about moral systems. Really important to highlight that, because although we're talking about the individual who's a moral leader, they don't exist in a vacuum at all. And so for them to make real change, they have to change the system and its component parts. And we see here one description, interlocking sets. Interlocking, really important. There's a sort of interdependence going on here of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms. I would say things like for example, emotional intelligence that work together to suppress or regulate selfishness and make social life possible. And this, I believe, is such a good description for not only moral systems, but morality itself. It regulates selfishness. Isn't that good? Think about leaders around right now. How many would you say are selfish? How many would you say are selfless? And they make social life possible. They make social life possible because when we have a pro-social society, then it is joyful, it's blissful. The tribe who helps itself, who looks after the weak, who looks after the vulnerable, protects from adversaries, he has strong people who use that strength, whether it's physical and or psychological, to do good. That to me is pro-social. That to me is a good social construct. Anyway, let's now go here, bit of a clunky gear change, to moral realism. Now, I'm going to read this and I'll attempt to summarize what I believe it's saying. According to moral realists, statements about what actions are morally required or permissible and statements about what dispositions or character traits are morally virtuous or vicious and so on are not mere expressions of subjective preferences but are objectively true or false according as they correspond with the facts of morality. Again, the English is unusual as far as I'm concerned, but I think what it's saying is are objectively true or false according to the corresponding belief about what is moral. There's another way to put it. Just as historical or geographic statements are true or false according to how they fit with historical or geographic facts. Now, what this is saying, in my opinion, is that there is a factual element to this. There is a right or wrong as far as the individual is concerned. So the moral realist says that, no, some things are, and we'll use this phrase here, virtuous or vicious, for example. Really good way to think about it, actually, in terms of an overview of one descriptor for morality. Are we virtuous? Are we good? Are we doing good? Or are we vicious? Are we harming those who are vulnerable, for example? That's just vicious, it's just cruel. And so moral realism says there are things which are right and wrong, in my opinion. That's what we're dealing with. And in that sense, I am a moral realist. However, that's not the only thing we need to consider when considering morals. So from this paper, aren't right and wrong just matters of opinion on moral relativism and subjectivism? This is what this chapter is about. We're only going to look at a couple of snippets, but hopefully interesting snippets. Normative relativism. So this kind of relativism is the strongest kind. It is the strongest kind because it goes beyond descriptive and meta-ethical relativism and makes an even grander claim. So again, imagine that relativism in terms of morals is a spectrum. This is at the sort of extreme end of absolute moral relativism, called normative relativism. According to this, no person or culture ought to judge the ethical codes of other cultures as being inferior, nor should any culture intervene in another culture to prevent it from carrying out the specifics of its ethical code. The normative relativist says that we might prefer the specific morality of our culture and even be able to offer reasons for doing so, but this does not imply that ours is superior to that of others. Normative relativists argue that because no objective, independent standpoint from which to evaluate ethical codes exists, no culture can justifiably say that its morality is objectively superior. Now, first thing I want to point out here, and so many writers do this, they seem to conflate the ethics and morality, and I believe that's not helpful. In my opinion, I'm not alone, morals are more personal. They're to do with what our code is, what our compass is telling us. And most of the people, in my opinion, particularly when a culture is similar, most of the time those people will agree on the big things, the core things that we say are that's vicious, that's virtuous, that's good, that's bad. Most people will. There are differences, but morals, in my opinion, are agreed upon by an awful lot of people, particularly when the culture is similar. Not necessarily exactly the same, but similar. There are outliers, there always are. But judging, I'm always wary of. I don't want to judge. But when we're talking about ethics, and this is why I've got to point out the fact that some people, in my opinion, mix up in what they write too readily, too easily, ethics and morals. Ethics, I believe, and I'm not alone, is a codifying of what we believe to be right or wrong, our morals, our general agreement as a village, let's say. We codify it, we give it a structure. And an ethical code, therefore, could be about a profession, it could be the medical profession, it could be about an organisation. Let's say in terms of the environment, what ethically should be done there. And it is an extension of morality, but because the language can get so specific, one could argue the judicial system is the same thing. It becomes specific. It tries to say, in this situation, when X happens, you should do Y, because that's the right thing to do ethically. but it comes from, again, in my opinion, it is fueled by, or should be at least, our feeling of what is right and wrong. Morally, our morals feed into that ethical structure. So in that sense, when we then look at this type of stuff here, when it says we shouldn't evaluate ethical codes, I've got some space for that. I can cope with that, yeah, because we can look at something that is different, and we shouldn't look down our noses at it because it's different. But if it morally clashes, then yeah, I feel that it's up to me whether I disagree with that or not. And if it is morally repugnant, if it is vicious, then I will disagree with it. And ethical, well, that's different. I mean, there's things like the Transparency Index, which is how transparent people feel dealing in certain countries is in terms of business. And another example, and this is just to highlight that neither one's right or wrong, is that a lot of, in business, a lot of things have to be put out to tender, particularly when it's public money. And we would go through a tendering process. And I think that's a good thing. But maybe you've been in places where bartering was more common. Technically, in quite a few situations, more than often we realise, in the UK at least, you could barter, but we tend not to do it because it isn't culturally the done thing. Culturally, in other places, you're not going to barter. Are you a fool? We can get the best deal. It's a win-win. It's the marketplace. It's the free market. So both of these systems are trying to do the same thing, and neither is right or wrong. They're just different. And so I don't think we should judge it. I don't think we have any right to say that's better. It's just different. But morally, I come back to, there are things which I believe that most of us would agree on. Not everyone, again, of course, but most of us. So let's then move on here. And this is same article to counter this idea about moral relativism. One of the strongest objections to relativism is the idea that if it's true that there can be no such thing as social reform. Why? How could we do it? We would have to look at something and say that needs reformed. We'd be judging. Or moral progress. What was okay 10 years ago isn't okay today. If each culture's ethical code is equally good and right, and again, they're describing it as a code, then when a country changes its ethical code from being pro-slavery to being anti-slavery, this moral change is merely a change rather than an improvement. And I'm sure that you could see right there that that's an improvement. Why? Because you feel it. Because slavery is repugnant. Anti-slavery is good. And this is what I'm getting at, although it says ethical code, but the ethical code in this instance is legislation probably that bubbles up, that is transmuted from the opinion, the feeling of right and wrong of a given population, and then it is codified. And so the ethical code may have been written differently and put into legislation, but before we get to that point, most of us would be going, that's just horrible. I cannot agree with that at all, because it's such a core thing. The way people can be abused in such a horrendous system. Hope that makes sense. So, moral improvement and progress require that there be some standard toward which a society or ethical code are approaching. Yes, absolutely. They also entail that the subsequent morality is better than the prior. But again, this is not something that can be said if relativism is true, because we'd have to judge it. We'd have to say, hey, this is better than it was. And don't we as a society continually want to improve? We don't always get it right. There are a lot of disagreements, but most people can agree on most things most of the time, in my opinion. And yes, there can be differences, but in those differences can also be progress if we're open-minded about it. So then, we come back to that article that I said was really a little bit like the start of a Marvel movie. Very aspirational, could be motivational, but a little bit nebulous. So here we go. What's the best way forward? There is a way to a more restorative form of leadership in our society. It will only come when individuals answer a call toward greater moral leadership. When developing leaders at any levels, but particularly at executive and societal levels, and I would say politicians, ask them to first identify their non-negotiables. those are decisions or behaviours that are likely not to be compromised, e.g. something they would do, e.g. what, sorry, rephrase that, I was probably almost slanderous there, something that would do physical harm to another person. So if I pause there for a second, the leader, now imagine this is someone who's maybe going to get promotion. This is someone who might be running for some kind of office and relying on people to vote them in. Isn't this a good thing? Wouldn't this be a good step to put in? It kind of is there, but it's not, and I'll come back to that. So we say to them, what's non-negotiable? And they tell us, and we write it down, and we hold them to that. And these are the behaviours that are likely not to be compromised. For example, doing physical harm to another person. So what is it that they won't compromise on? What will this leader not compromise on? We need to know that, and they need to be held to account for it. And then invite the leader to envision scenarios where this type of decision or behaviour would likely arise. Finally, work through the scenarios using multiple counter decisions and outcomes to help the leader understand the seriousness and impact of the decisions, actions and inactions. And what we've got there is like coaching, it's mentoring, it's training, it's development. This is good. Imagine that. Imagine that if the leaders who are around had gone through something like this and kind of almost like passed a test, but certainly went through the thought exercise to ensure that when they're faced with those complicated problems, they're reminded, because I've already rehearsed this thing is non-negotiable. So the way I solve it has got to be in line with that which is non-negotiable. Now, to come back to the non-negotiables, what are we seeing right now in terms of politicians? What do we see? To get into power, a lot of them say whatever they think is going to get them into power. Not all of them, but a lot of them. That is disgusting. That is morally repugnant. What sort of setup do we have? We've got a setup as well where people can make the promises, break the promises. They're not, in no way can they be held to account for that. It's just, oh well, things changed. And then, certainly in the political arena, they don't answer questions. They can get away with not answering questions. So the whole thing sucks, essentially, and it's the antithesis of what moral leadership needs to be and the antithesis of the environment that it can exist within, because it's too easy for people to be expedient. So what we should be saying, to get to that point that I raised earlier, but what can we do about it? What we should be saying is you need to tell us what you represent, what is non-negotiable for you, and you also need to we record it. It is written down, and you need to be monitored. There's this strange anomaly, I've talked about it before. When people become a supervisor, they might be on probation for 6 months in a particular job, or 3 months or 6 months as a manager. But the higher up that people go, bizarrely, there is no probation. And so we need that to be there, which is why, as I've said before, transparency, openness and honesty must be de rigueur. We need those things in place. We have to demand it. And so anyone running for office, anyone in fact running for a term in a business, if I could call it that, tenure, whether it's long-term or temporary, when they get to a certain level, I mean ultimately any level, but particularly at those higher levels where they can do so much good or harm, they have to lay out what's non-negotiable. And in particular with politicians. And then having said it, we're aware of it, we're watching it. And yet, of course, force majeure, that can kick in, but we've defined what that is. And as they are monitored, as they go along, and I believe we'd have to be kind in that situation as well, not continually cruel and battering them. You know, our job is also to be moral, if they're going to be moral. To then say, okay, what's going on? Why did that not happen? And to get transparency. And imagine if they were honest and open at that point. We're more likely to get on board and on side with them. But the system that we have right now, where organisations and companies can just do what they want, it's for the shareholders. Well, we'll hold the shareholder to account as well then. Who the heck are these people? And they'll do things which are environmentally damaging, for example. And in terms of leading countries or having a voice on the so-called world stage, who are these people? They need to be held to account. And one of the ways to do it is to start before they get into power. So it's no good politicians right now who are saying, I'll do this, 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 and this, if you didn't do it before. There seems to be there a lack of moral fibre and moral compass. What you're doing now looks expedient. And for those people, whoever they are, however beguiling they look and seem, and nice and decent and on your side, write it down, what's non-negotiable. And somehow we need to get in place, certainly in the UK at least, a system where they not only have to answer questions, but they have to be held to account. Why didn't you do? Why aren't you doing what you said you would do? How dare you? And we have to find a way, therefore, that they are replaced by someone else. Because that's what would happen in business. It's what happens in a sports team. It's what happens to many of us in real life, away from the political bubble. Don't you think? Anyway, that would be my choice. Let's then look at moral leadership in the wider sense. And again, from the article where I was talking about moral systems and Jonathan Haidt. So this is from that article, back to that one. And you see here the macro level and the micro level, initiating, scaling up and securing. So we've got moral awareness and motivation, institutional contradictions. And so we're talking here about the individual, the potential moral leader. And they look around and think, this is wrong. This is vicious rather than virtuous. And that sense of wrongness is not necessarily codified anywhere. It is something they feel. It goes against the grain, and they speak to other people and they say, no, you're right. This is wrong. So they've identified almost like a cognitive dissonance that's going on, and they don't like it. So what do? If they're going to be a moral leader? They defy. They say this is wrong. They stand up, they put their head above the parapet. And that requires moral courage, bravery to do that. And then they will, of course, because we're also talking, that's why I put it in earlier, about a system, a systemic change which is required. They need to build. They need to network. They need to have a group of people, like-minded individuals. And they may have to negotiate on some things to make that work, but not on the non-negotiables. Which is why that's such an important point. Really, really important point. Because if they move those non-negotiables, then, and I'm sure this has happened to a lot of people, they go in with good intentions and things are knocked sideways from the get-go. So they negotiate, but in the area of what is morally acceptable to that particular group. And then they formalize it somehow, codify it, and they guard it. They make sure that that better system, that better moral system is in place. Maybe needs updated and refined as we go along. But where does it begin? Well, I've added this to the slide. Same slide, my extra bit here. Moral courage. And right now there are people who are, well, how would I describe them? They may even be watching this video at some point. They know they've got to do the right thing morally. And this is where I believe some real change and a shift in who these leaders that we see around us begins. So, I guess for me, it remains to be seen whether we will find a way forward that is acceptable. But I am hopeful, because if you look around, certainly in the UK, there have been some changes, some U-turns. Why is that? Because the people have a voice. It is a democratic system. And when you've got some group of leaders and headed up by a particular leader, and when they change things, when they introduce things that most other people see as morally wrong and even repugnant, then you can see that culturally it doesn't fit. It doesn't go down well. And that's like the opposite of what they should be doing. It doesn't mean to say there won't be differences, but that's one of the reasons that in the UK, I believe there's been such strife, because we've seen a leader and a leadership team who have carried out actions, made decisions, which other people are just bemused by at best and aghast by, probably more realistically for most people. What is going on? How can you think that that was the right thing to do? How is that virtuous? It was more vicious than anything else. And so moral leadership and decision making are important. And I say to you, and maybe listening, thinking about leadership or in a leadership position, practice moral courage. Make that brave decision, take that brave step. And to you and me who may not be in those positions, maybe we want to be in the future, we have a voice. We all need to speak up. Again, without sounding like the beginning of a Marvel movie, or I don't mean to, let me just finish off by saying, imagine how things would be if we had leaders who were truly moral and practicing moral courage. Anyway, if you've listened to the video thus far and you are a subscriber, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference. If you're thinking of subscribing, please consider it. It does, again, make a big difference on this particular platform. If you like this video, please like and comment. And also, please consider sharing, particularly given the subject matter. You never know where it might end up. Anyway, for the moment, from me, bye for now.